Good morning, students, or good afternoon, depending on when you're watching this. We are going to talk about the colonial economy today. So last unit, we talked about the founding of New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. Today, we're going to look at just a little bit about the economy or how people made a living in each of those three regions. Let's start with New England. Remember that New England consists of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. There were four main ways or four main industries in New England. The first is called subsistence farming. Subsistence means to survive. So these were farmers who produced just enough food to feed their family. They might have a little excess surplus that they could sell or trade on the side, but for the most part, they are farming to feed their families. Fishing was a huge industry in New England up in those cool Atlantic waters. Cod, whale, halibut, crab, oysters, lobster were your main catches. Merchant shippers and shipbuilding. So a lot of great harbors and then the surplus of trade goods shipped to the other colonies and the mother country, England, as well. And fur trading, and that might be cut off at the bottom of your presentation, but fur trading, basically trapping little animals, killing them, using their fur for hats, clothing, blankets, things like that. Most of the population was made up by English settlers. Didn't have a lot of diversity in New England. Slavery, although it did exist, it was not very important. Most of your workforce were family-run businesses, mom, dad, and kids. We did see the apprentice program a lot in New England. So this is where a young boy would leave home and learn a trade or a craft or skill from a master craftsman. And this might start at the age of like 10 or 11 years old, and they would work for a few years as a master craftsman, let's say as a carpenter, learning everything from that master craftsman. And then eventually, when they got old enough, they'd become what's called a journeyman. And a journeyman is where you would travel around from town to town and make money trying to perfect your craft. And then eventually, you save up enough money and you become your own master craftsman. And then the cycle continues. You would take on an apprentice. That apprentice would become a journeyman. That journeyman would become a master craftsman, so on and so forth. All right, the middle colonies. Remember, the middle colonies are New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. The middle colonies are nicknamed the breadbasket colonies. They were nicknamed the breadbasket colonies because of the high amount of wheat and barley and oats that were produced. So industry one are cash crops and staple crops. So cash crops and staple crops are slightly different. Cash crops are grown to be sold as a profit, but then you also grow them and you keep portion of that to feed your family. And there's several examples listed there. We do put in like cattle and livestock under the cash crop, even though it's not a crop that you would grow, but you would raise cattle, sell it, and or slaughter them to eat for your own family. Lumbering. A lot of trees and forests. If you remember, Pennsylvania itself translates to Penn's Woods. So a lot of forests in the middle colonies. And they would chop those trees down and then sell the lumber and the supplies back to, they would ship them north to the New England shipbuilders. Remember, all ships were made from wood at this time. Iron mills. A lot of iron ore deposits in the middle colonies, and so they would mine for the iron and manufacture iron-based items. Tools, weapons, cooking utensils, pots, pans, anything made of iron. In the middle colonies, the main workforce was actually indentured servants. This is a term we talked about last chapter. An indentured servant is somebody that owes a debt to somebody, and they have to usually work 4 to 7 years to pay that debt off. They are not an enslaved person. They are a free person, but their rights were limited a bit, and they were bound to whoever had their indentured contract. The Middle Colonies was a very diverse group for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was originally settled by the Dutch and the Swedish, and some of those colonies were then overtaken by the English, and so a lot of those early Dutch and Swedish settlers just stayed. But also because of their religious toleration and just their toleration for others, you had a lot of immigrants coming from Ireland and Germany as well, and so a very diverse mix. The largest colonial city in all the colonies, not just the Middle Colonies, but all the colonies, was Philadelphia by the late 1700s. And it only had about 24,000 people, but that was a big city back then. By comparison, Lee Summit has over 100,000 people. So the largest colonial city was a fourth of the size of Lee Summit is today. So that gives you a little bit of perspective. New York City was the second largest city, also in the Middle Colonies. It had about 18,000 people. And then Boston up in Massachusetts would have been the third largest city. All right, now we get to the southern colonies. Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Plantation crop farming, different than the farming in New England, which was subsistence farming, and even different than the Middle Colonies, which was cash crops, but also kind of staple crop farming. The plantation crop farming had one purpose, and that was to make as much money as possible. You are not growing these crops to use for your own family. You are growing tobacco, cotton, rice, and indigo, and you're shipping this out to other parts of the colonies, and then also hopefully making some money by shipping it out to other parts of the world. To make way for all of those crops that need to be planted, you need maximum use of land, and so they would clear as many trees as possible. And rather than just wasting that lumber, they would send it north to the New England shipbuilders, very similar to what the Middle Colonies did. But your number one crop, or your number one industry, was plantation crop farming. Of course, slavery was the main workforce on the plantations. Move down, see if you can see that statistic. 85% of all slaves in the 13 colonies lived in the South. So you did have slaves living in all 13 colonies, but a majority of them were living in the South, a large majority. In fact, 40% of the entire Southern population was made up of slaves. So you basically had a 60% free person, 40% enslaved person population in the South. There was something called slave codes. Slave codes were laws that were made to control the slaves and keep them from uprising. Here are some examples. Slaves were branded with a hot branding iron to show ownership. If you were caught stealing, you were put to death by your master. Slaves were not allowed to own weapons. They were not allowed to hold church meetings. Church and religion gives slaves hope, and they did not want enslaved people having hope on the plantations. They were not allowed to read or write. They did not want them passing information from plantation to plantation. And then runaway slaves, once captured, would be tortured and or killed in front of the other slaves to set an example, to basically not run away. All right, now we're going to talk about the back country. So the back country is this red, the kind of the red splotchy areas. So most of your population is going to live along the coastline. But some people who kind of wanted to live off the land and didn't want to be a part of the big cities, they would move kind of over near the Appalachian Mountain region. And this was mostly Scots-Irish. And people in the backcountry, or the wilderness, if you want to think of it like that, they lived in log cabins on small farms. Mostly Scots-Irish, living off what they could grow, raise, gather, or kill. About the only other way that they got what they needed was by trading with the Native Americans. And they would pay with deer skins, also called buckskins, and then eventually that was shortened to the term buck. And so they would pay for things with bucks. And so if you ever hear the term, or you hear the phrase like instead of saying something costs $10, it costs $10. Okay, the term buck is a colonial term that refers to buckskins or deerskins, and so it was a unit of currency in the wilderness. So you might trade, extra corn that the Native Americans have, but the Native Americans want 7 buckskins or $7 for however much corn you're trying to buy from them. Let's talk a little bit about women in the colonial economy. Women were the primary caretaker of the home and the family. Some were allowed to work as shopkeepers, farmers, nurses, cooks, midwives, and doctors, but you could not work as a female without your husband's permission. And the husbands had the right to keep all of the wages or money that was earned by the wife. Very few women had any kind of voice in politics. They were not allowed to vote. And really, voting rights were left to only white males who owned land. All right, our last topic. Thanks for hanging in there with me. The Navigation Acts of 1691. So the Navigation Acts were laws passed by the mother country, England, against the colonies as a way to restrict colonial trade. So remember, England owns the colonies, okay? We are not an independent nation. There is no United States of America at this time. I'm going to move my box over here, see if that works a little bit better. The idea is make as much money for the mother country or England as possible. This is called mercantilism. So law number 1, all shipping had to be done on English-built ships. The idea was they wanted to eliminate their competing shipbuilding companies, particularly the Dutch. So this would be like if we made a law in America today that said you could only buy American-made cars. You can only buy Chevy, Ford, Chrysler, GM. You can't buy Toyota, Honda, Acura, Volkswagen, Mercedes. You cannot buy any foreign automobiles. You can only buy American-made cars. So that's what that law would be similar to. Law 2, only certain raw materials from the American colonies could be sold to England or its colonies. And this was a pretty significant list of items. And basically what the English were saying, the English crown was saying is, if you grow tobacco, you can't sell your tobacco to anybody in the world. You have to only sell it to England or the English colonies. And the idea was to try to create a monopoly on these products and not allow other rival countries to have them. And so there's a list of kind of the big topic items that were not allowed to be sold. Tobacco, cotton, rice, fur, lumber, those kinds of things. Law 3, all European imports to the colonies had to first pass through English ports to get an extra tax, which was called a duty, D-U-T-Y. So this extra tax had to be placed on the goods. And the idea is that extra tax is going to go to the pocket of the king. So American colonists were paying a touch more, just a little bit more, for their products than citizens living in England were. So if England was importing products from, say, Spain, they would go to England first, unload those products for the English citizens, and then some of them would be shipped over to America, but an extra tax would be placed on them. So that obviously did not sit well with the colonists. In Law 4, American colonists were forbidden from producing certain manufactured goods. The idea here was to prevent colonists from competing with English manufacturers. They did not want the colonists making their own tools and guns and clothes and furniture and stuff like that. They wanted the colonists to buy everything from England to make money to the English manufacturers. And of course, the colonists started to get kind of that independent spirit and basically were, hey, we can make our own guns. We have our own gunsmiths over here. Or we can make our own tools. We have our own blacksmiths over here. Why do we have to buy back from the mother country and wait for those to be transported over here? And that is your semi-brief overview of colonial economy. Thank you for hanging in there.